Good morning, Wilf.
Fastest growing economy in the G7 again. A moment to celebrate?
So, look, of course, any growth is to be welcome, particularly from a government that has singularly failed to deliver it since it came into office. But look, let's look at those numbers. You mentioned some of the monthly data there. In fact, the March data at 0.2% is under half the growth rate of the month before. The second point I would make is none of this data captures the actuality of national insurance increases for employers, the business rates increases that many businesses are having up and down the country, the employment legislation that's coming down the line that the Treasury itself says could load businesses up with additional costs of £5 billion. And of course, the forecast from the IMF, the Bank of England, the Office for Budget Responsibility has constantly been to downgrade growth. In fact, the OBR downgrading growth to half what they were originally assuming for this year. So a little bit premature, I think, to start popping the champagne corks.
Which I don't think anybody is doing. I guess these numbers also don't capture a snapshot of what is going on around the world at the moment. And there's been a lot of challenges, of course, we don't even need to remind people of. And it is a fact that this is the fastest reading of the G7 for the 3 months that we have data for so far.
Well, you talk about externalities and things happening around the world. Of course, they happen all the time. That's what happens to open economies. The most important thing, therefore, is to have a resilient and strong economy. And what we've seen with the management of our economy by this government is anything but that. So we have seen generally low growth. We've seen higher inflation than was originally forecast under us. That's mean interest rates have been higher for longer. The servicing costs on our national debt, to which this high borrowing government has been contributing, are about 100 billion. That's twice what we're spending on defence every year, just going on servicing our costs, not going on public sector and improving services and so on. And all of that adds up to an economy where the fiscal headroom, which the Chancellor had back in the autumn, was blown. She's now rebuilt that. It's likely to be blown again. And we're going to have some further tough decisions, I think, in the autumn. And as to what is causing that, many organisations, including the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, a very respected think tank, has looked very closely at this and determined that whilst, of course, what's happening internationally has an impact, the bulk of the impact actually is through the choices this government has taken, particularly around national insurance, a tax on jobs. That is what has been holding us back.
Of course, the size of the interest payments are more relating to the huge growth in debt during the last government than any marginal changes so far.
Well, we did have COVID and the Ukraine war and things that we spent 400 billion supporting the economy.
International and external factors that you're dismissing, you know.
Well, no, I'm not dismissing them. I'm only up to the fact that we had to spend some money under those circumstances.
No, I get that.
But we've not got COVID at the moment. We've not got the Ukraine war. We have got.
I get that, but you can't
people
say that
very
external
clearly
factors are,
they're both in play, Wilf. But the point that I'm making is, if the argument is, oh well, it's all to do with what's happening overseas, that is far from the case.
No, it's
this
not
government
what
took some dreadful choices, has left us with a very weak economy, and that is the root of the problem, I'm afraid.
In terms of some of the things that haven't taken effect yet, obviously we've got a reprieve, I think it's fair to call it, on trade terms with the US, and we do have a trade deal with India. Prospects next week of a new set of trade terms with the EU. In general, on all of those things, do you welcome rationalisation of trade terms?
It's really important to go out and strike deals, but they've got to be the right deals. Now, take the US deal, for example. So the government is trumpeting the fact that the Americans rode back on some of the additional tariffs that they were going to bring in. But if you look at where we've ended up in this deal compared to under the last Conservative government, we are paying about 3 times the level of tariffs on our exports to the United States than was the case then. And the United States is paying about 1/3 in tariffs on what it's exporting into us. That doesn't feel like a very good deal to me. And there's a lot further that we need to go with the US. This is not a fully formed free trade agreement at the moment. But as things stand on the tariff element, at least, it doesn't look that great to me.
What would you have done differently?
So we would have got in the room with President Trump and Scott Bessent and others much earlier. We would not have had the mood music that was set by the Labour front bench, with a lot of silly things, frankly, they said about President Trump initially. And we would have built on the progress that we made during that first Trump administration, where actually we were getting close to a deal. Now, Biden then came along and killed that stone dead. But the reality was we had made a lot of progress, and we would have got in there earlier, and we would have built a better relationship and got a better deal. And we certainly wouldn't have ended up in a worse position than we were back when we were in power.
Sir Wilfred Frost told
Well,
this...
we wouldn't have fired him either, incidentally. That's another thing they did.
Well, interestingly,
great experience.
He told this programme that in the first administration they only got about halfway in negotiations, and that his changing of post wouldn't have made a difference to the negotiations. But that was his point of view on that. On the renegotiation with the EU, it's really fascinating timing-wise, because clearly, as part of the negotiation about the economy, immigration and free movement of people will come up. I'm sure you've seen the coverage from Sam Coates' exclusive capturing of a Chris Philp recording from 2020. The bottom line of that is that Brexit, as we all sit here today and can look back on it, Brexit has made it harder to control illegal immigration.
So what Brexit did was gave us control of our borders. It gave us the ability to decide how we will let people into our country or not, rather than it being free movement across Europe. On the recording, I listened to the recording last night, and it seems to me what Chris Philp was stating was just the blindingly obvious, that, of course, when we were a member of the EU, we were a part of Dublin III, which meant that if asylum was claimed in a particular country and then that person came to another country, they could be returned to that original country. I don't understand why his statements about that should be of any interest whatsoever. Well, what we were doing at the time we were in government was bringing forward Rwanda, the deterrent to stop illegal migration in the first place, focusing on returns deals with other countries, such as Albania, which reduced the flow across the Channel by over 90%. What this government's done is to unwind most of that, including which has led to 12,000 illegal migrants coming across the Channel. As a direct consequence of Labour's policy. That's a record this year. It's going up, not down.
Yeah, the Rwanda policy is one thing. I put that aside, because I think this is just a really interesting question about Brexit, and what Chris Philp said or not we'll put aside. But you said what Brexit gave us was the ability to control our borders.
Yeah.
What was revealed, whether it's sensational or not, in the Chris Philp recording, and you just touched on, is perhaps that you should tweak that phrase and say what Brexit gave us was the ability to try and control our borders, but actually tie our hands behind the back, because we can no longer use the Dublin Agreement to return people that cross on a small boat back to where they came from.
Yeah, but we've got something much more significant by having Brexit, which is complete control of who comes into our country. And that is hugely more powerful in terms of potentially controlling net migration than the Dublin III Agreement. But why are we sensationalising Chris Philp's comments? He was just making an obvious statement. I don't know why it became
this is really interesting.
A big thing for Sky.
Maybe it gave us the chance to control legal immigration, albeit, of course, the numbers soared in your government. But did it make it harder to control illegal immigration? Small boat crossings, Chris Philp's recording does reveal that 40% of those pre-Brexit would have been returned to continental Europe, and the Europeans wouldn't have been able to do anything about it.
Yes, and conversely, of course, under the Dublin III arrangements, migrants could be sent back to the UK who had first entered the UK and gone elsewhere. So
which is
it could have worked.
Vastly lower percentage.
It could have worked. Well, I'm just setting it out exactly as it is in the point of fairness. But look, there's no doubt it is a different arrangement being outside the EU than being in the EU. But if the question is, do you have more control over your borders and the potential to control net migration if you're outside the EU rather than inside the EU? Then the answer is it's an emphatic yes. Of course, if you're not part of the single market and free movement across Europe, of course you then have the ability to control who comes into your country. And that's what we moved to when we had Brexit.
Mel Stride, great to see you as always. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.